Good afternoon. My name is Timm. I'm from IBM. And today I'm going to be talking about the FHIR Bulk Export API and specifically the use of the group resource to define cohorts for export. So we have the Bulk Export API, which is part of the Bulk Data Access Implementation Guide. And it allows us to asynchronously export data in ND-JSON or flat FHIR format. It supports a few different ways of doing this at the system level, patient level, and then group level. Data can be filtered by resource type, and you can provide some detailed information on how data should be exported through the group level resource. Here's a FHIR group resource. We can specify characteristics of the group, which is kind of intentional, or we can enumerate members of the group directly or extensionally. The group characteristic element is actually a set of code value pairs. The value can be a number of different data types. It allows you to include or exclude characteristics. Multiple characteristics are logically ANDed together. For example, A and B and C. There's a Boolean exclude element, sub-element, that allows you to also have a not, a logical not. So we could have A and not B and C. So here's an example, cohort definition, a simple example. We are looking for, in our repository, all female patients, age 13 to 15, exclusive. We want to exclude patients who meet at least one of the following conditions during the last 12 months. Either they were pregnant or had an abortion in the last 12 months. So for this simple cohort definition example, we have 4 characteristics, 2 includes and 2 excludes. So they are gender, age, pregnant, and abortion. So logically, the expression would essentially be A and B, and not C or D, which can be simplified into A and B and not C and not D. So using the group characteristic, there are a number of ways that we could do this. We could specify these 4 characteristics as 4 characteristic elements, where the code specifies what the characteristic is, and then the value is more information about that, or about the specific value for that characteristic. So, for example, for gender, we have a codable concept. In this case, I'm just using administrative gender. There are other places from which we could draw gender from, but for now, just administrative gender, and the code is female. For age, we have a range, which is 13 to 55. So the range high subproperty is inclusive, and therefore we need to set it to 55 because, as you remember, it was 56 exclusive. Then we have 2 excludes. So pregnant, in this case, it's just a simple Boolean characteristic. So the code is pregnant, and the value is true. And then we have some time associated with it. So it's in the last 12 months. So we have a period, which is a start and end of start 12 months ago and end of today. Similarly, for abortion, we have just simple Boolean characteristic. The code is abortion and the value is true. Exclude is true. And then again, we have that same period. So there's also this idea of relative time. There's a relative time extension that we can add to period, which would allow us to specify time relative to now. So that's an option that we can use to represent the same information. So now we have the group characteristic specified for this simple example. we want to come up with a way to essentially generate FHIR search queries. And so we'll break it apart. So for female patients, this is just a simple search query. Same with age. We convert the age range into a date range, and we can test that against the birth date. And then pregnant in the last 12 months. So this could be essentially an observation search with a code for pregnancy observation is the type of observation, and then in this case SNOMED for pregnant, and then the date range, which was the last 12 months, so we just converted that. And then abortion in the last 12 months. In this case, we're treating that as a procedure with the SNOMED code, and then the same date range. So we have these 4 searches, but now we need to combine them to kind of get the cohort that we're looking for. And we have some limitations in the FHIR search specification that can make this a little bit tricky, even for this simple example. So observation returns observations and not patients. So we could use reverse chaining. Unfortunately, with reverse chaining, we can't have more than one search parameter using the has parameter. We can have a single composite search parameter, but we cannot and 2 search parameters together after a has. They're treated separately if you have 2 hases. So that's a tricky thing. We could use the search filter syntax, where filter is a search parameter, and then we specify using the search filter syntax, code is equal to this link code, and value concept is subsumed by this SNOMED concept, and then or date is this and this. Same for we could do chaining and client-side filtering. So we could append. We could search for observations and then just get the subject back, and then go back and get the patients that we returned from that query. So if we were to run all of these queries, we would end up with some set theory here to achieve the final output of the cohort. So A and B are simple search queries. We can combine them to gender equals female and birth date is in this range, whereas C and D, they're complex queries, so they need to be performed independently. And then what we end up having to do is some set operations. So we want the intersection of A and B. That's easy. That's just that simple search query. And then we want to do a set difference, a C union D. So any patients that had an abortion and or were pregnant or are pregnant we would take that out of A intersect B. So some initial conclusions on this approach. We can use the group resource characteristic element to define basic cohorts using logical ands and nots. We don't have a logical or. And we can generate search queries for the characteristics elements, but we may need to write specific adapter logic for specific characteristic codes to handle the translation of the characteristic to the search query. And we also may need to use advanced search features and or the search filter syntax. And then finally, we may need to even do set operations outside of the persistence layer to make it all work. So some alternatives to consider, looking at the measure resource and the clinical quality language. We could add an expression as one of the choice types for group characteristic. That would kind of open things up. We could export basic groups and perform additional filtering outside of FHIR. So we could convert FHIR to Parquet and then use tools like Apache Sparks to define and produce and generate our cohorts. Or we could do something that we've created a prototype for, which is to take FHIR and convert it to OMOP, and then use tooling like Atlas to define and generate cohorts. Some future work, search, filter, syntax implementation. The IBM FHIR Server doesn't currently support this, but basically we would convert the filter syntax to an ANTLR grammar and generate a parser for it, and then generate a translator that would take an instance of the abstract syntax tree and convert it to SQL against our backend data store. We're also, we could also have an implementation defined extend operation that converts an intentional group resource into an extensional group resource, similar to value set expansion. That might be useful. Tooling to build group-based cohort definitions. So using the group characteristic to specify complex cohorts could be rather tricky, and so tooling to kind of support that activity could be useful. And then also looking at just counts, identifying patients that have data, that have the data required to even build the cohort, and kind of successively looking at patients that have gender, patients that have birthday. We wouldn't even be able to include them in the cohort if they don't have kind of the requisite fields. And so having a way to kind of look at and interactively look at your repository of patient data and identify which things would be candidates to become part of a cohort could be useful. And that's it. Any questions?